The ambush came at the worst possible moment. Sergeant First Class Daniel Danny Pacheco was crossing a stream when the first shots rang out. He was alone, separated from his patrol, his rifle slung across his back as he waded through chest-deep water. The jungle pressed close on both sides, the canopy blocking out the afternoon sun, the water cold against his skin. The perfect target, the perfect kill zone. The bullet missed his head by inches. He heard it crack past his ear before the sound of the shot reached him. The second shot hit the water beside him, sending up a geyser of spray that momentarily blinded him. The third struck the wooden stock of his rifle, shattering it into splinters, spinning him around and dumping him face first into the current. He went under. The water closed over his head, brown and murky, filled with sediment that turned everything dark. He could hear the muffled crack of more shots, could feel the bullets cutting through the water around him. He stayed under, let the stream carry him downstream while the Japanese soldiers on the bank fired at shadows and ripples. His lungs burned for air, but he forced himself to wait. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15, until the current had carried him out of the kill zone. When he surfaced 30 yards later, behind a tangle of fallen trees, 30 Japanese soldiers were spreading out along the bank, searching for his body. He could see them through the branches, olive uniforms, rifles at the ready, officers barking orders in Japanese. They were hunting him. They thought they had wounded him, maybe killed him. They were coming to finish the job. Danny Pacheco was 27 years old, a former ranch hand from the Big Island of Hawaii, and he had just made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't going to run, he was going to fight. It was February 23rd, 1945. The Philippines, somewhere in the mountains of northern Luzon. The American forces were pushing inland, grinding through Japanese resistance mile by bloody mile, paying for every hilltop and river crossing with blood. Pacheco's unit, the 25th Infantry Division, had been tasked with clearing the mountain trails that the Japanese used to move supplies and reinforcements. It was brutal work. The jungle was dense, the terrain treacherous, the enemy dug in and determined to fight to the last man. Every patrol was a gamble, every trail a potential ambush site. Men died in these mountains every day, their bodies swallowed by the jungle, sometimes never found. The patrol had been routine, 8 men moving through the jungle in single file, looking for signs of enemy activity. They had found plenty: abandoned campsites with warm ashes, discarded equipment that looked recently dropped, the remains of cooking fires that still smelled of rice. The Japanese were close. Too close. The main ambush had hit the patrol 2 hours ago, on a ridge 3 miles to the south. Pacheco had been on point when the firing started, separated from the others by a bend in the trail. By the time he worked his way back, the fight was over. 3 Americans dead, 4 wounded, the survivors retreating toward the base. Pacheco had tried to follow, but a Japanese patrol had cut him off. Then another, and another. The Japanese were everywhere, flooding into the area to exploit their success, hunting for stragglers. Now he was trapped behind enemy lines, alone, with a broken rifle and 30 soldiers searching for him. Any reasonable man would have hidden, would have waited for the Japanese to leave, then slipped away in the darkness, would have made his way back to friendly lines as quietly as possible. Danny Pacheco had never been a reasonable man. He was descended from Hawaiian Paniolo, the cowboys who had worked the cattle ranches of the Big Island for generations, since the 1830s when Mexican vaqueros had first come to teach Hawaiians the art of horsemanship. The Paniolo had developed their own style, their own traditions, their own way of life that was part Mexican, part Hawaiian, and entirely unique. His grandfather had broken horses for King Kalakaua, had ridden in the royal processions, had been one of the finest horsemen in the islands. His father had ridden the ranges of Parker Ranch, one of the largest cattle ranches in the United States, until the war came and took his sons. Danny had grown up in the saddle. He had roped his first calf at 8, broken his first horse at 12, worked full-time on the ranch by 16. He knew the Big Island like he knew his own body. Every trail, every valley, every hidden spring where cattle gathered in the dry season. The Paniolo had a saying passed down from the vaqueros: when the bull charges, you don't run, you grab its horns. It was a philosophy that had served Danny well. When challenges came, and challenges always came on a working ranch, you didn't back down. You faced them head on, grabbed hold, and didn't let go until the job was done. 30 Japanese soldiers were charging. Pacheco intended to grab their horns. He took stock of his situation, forcing himself to think clearly despite the adrenaline flooding his system. His rifle was destroyed, the stock shattered, the action fouled with water and debris, useless as a weapon. His .45 pistol was still functional, tucked into its holster at his hip, the leather keeping out most of the water. He had only 2 magazines, 16 rounds total. His knife was sharp, a Ka-Bar fighting knife that he had honed the night before. He had 4 grenades liberated from a dead Japanese soldier during an earlier engagement. Not much, but something. And he had the jungle. The jungle was his ally. He had grown up in forests like this. Not exactly like this, but close enough. The Big Island had its share of dense vegetation, steep ravines, treacherous terrain. The upland forests of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa had prepared him for this, had taught him how to move silently through thick brush, how to read the landscape, how to become invisible when he needed to be. The Japanese knew the jungle too, but they didn't know it as well as he did, and they were looking for a dead man, not a hunter. Pacheco slipped into the undergrowth and began to stalk his prey. The first Japanese soldier died without knowing he was in danger. He was a young private, probably no more than 18, who had wandered away from his squad to relieve himself. He never saw Pacheco coming, never heard the rustle of leaves, never felt the presence behind him until the knife was already at his throat. Pacheco killed him quickly, silently, the way his grandfather had taught him to kill wild pigs in the forests of the Big Island. One hand over the mouth, one quick slash, lower the body gently to the ground. He stripped the soldier of his rifle, an Arisaka Type 99, and his ammunition. He took the man's canteen, his rations, his grenades. Everything useful, nothing that would slow him down. Then he melted back into the jungle and waited for the next opportunity. The second soldier died an hour later, then the third. Pacheco was patient. He didn't rush, didn't take unnecessary risks, didn't let the adrenaline push him into mistakes. He watched the Japanese patrols from concealment, learned their patterns, identified the soldiers who were careless or isolated. Then he killed them, one by one, silent as a ghost. The Japanese didn't understand what was happening. They were searching for a dead American, or at most a wounded fugitive trying to escape. Instead, they were being hunted. Their men were disappearing, one by one, their bodies found hours later with their throats cut. By nightfall, 7 Japanese soldiers were dead, and the rest were terrified. Pacheco could hear them talking, their voices carrying through the jungle in the quiet hours after sunset. They were speaking Japanese, which he didn't understand, but he could hear the fear in their tones, the uncertainty, the growing realization that something was very wrong. Good. Fear was a weapon. The Paniolo had taught him that too. The night belonged to Pacheco. He moved through the darkness with the confidence of a man who had spent his life in wild country. The jungle was alive around him. Insects chirping in rhythmic waves, nightbirds calling to each other, the constant rustle of wind through the canopy above. Every sound was information, every shadow a potential hiding place or ambush site. The darkness was his element. Back home on the Big Island, he had spent countless nights riding the ranges, checking on cattle, tracking predators that threatened the herd. He had learned to see with more than his eyes, to feel the movement of the air, to hear the subtle changes in the night sounds that signaled danger or opportunity. The Japanese had set up a perimeter, clustering together for safety. They had built fires, against regulations probably, but fear made men do foolish things, and posted sentries at regular intervals. They had done everything they could to protect themselves from the thing that was hunting them. It wasn't enough. Pacheco crept to within 20 yards of their camp, moving inches at a time, testing each footfall before committing his weight. He could see their faces in the firelight. Young faces, most of them, boys barely out of their teens. They looked tired and scared, huddled around the flames like children frightened of the dark. He felt no pity. These were the men who had killed his friends, who had ambushed his patrol, who would kill him without hesitation if they found him. War had no room for pity. He counted them, 23 soldiers remaining, plus what looked like 2 officers conferring near the largest fire. 25 enemies, all armed, all theoretically alert. The odds were impossible. But Pacheco had learned something in his years on the ranch. The odds didn't matter if you were smart enough, bold enough, and willing to accept the consequences if things went wrong. He couldn't fight them directly. Even with the captured Arisaka and his 45, he was massively outgunned. A frontal assault would be suicide, but he didn't need to fight them directly. He just needed to break them. He pulled the pin on one of his grenades and threw it into the middle of their camp. The explosion shattered the night. The fire scattered in a spray of embers. Men screamed and dove for cover. Rifles cracked as soldiers fired blindly into the darkness. Pacheco was already moving, circling the camp in a wide arc, appearing from a completely different direction to fire 3 quick shots with the Arisaka before vanishing again. The Japanese fired back, but they were shooting at shadows. They couldn't see him, couldn't track him, couldn't understand how one man could be in so many places at once. The jungle swallowed the muzzle flashes, made it impossible to determine direction or distance. Pacheco threw a second grenade from the opposite side of the camp. More explosions, more screaming, more chaos. He kept moving, never stopping, never giving them a fixed target. He fired from the north, then the east, then the south. He threw his third grenade into a cluster of men who were trying to organize a counterattack. He used the darkness and the confusion to get close, to kill with his knife when bullets would have revealed his position. By the time the Japanese officers restored order, 4 more of their men were dead or wounded, and the rest were on the verge of panic. They had been ambushed by what felt like a full American squad, but there were no American bodies, no signs of a larger force, just one ghost, haunting the jungle, killing them one by one. Dawn found the Japanese in full retreat. Pacheco watched them go from the top of a ridge, counting the survivors as they filed down the trail toward their base camp. 18 soldiers, down from 30. He had killed 12 men in less than 24 hours, and he had done it alone. But he wasn't satisfied. 12 dead Japanese didn't help his unit. 12 dead Japanese didn't provide the intelligence that command needed to plan the next assault. 12 dead Japanese were just bodies in the jungle. He needed something more. He needed a prisoner. Pacheco had never taken a prisoner before. It wasn't something that happened often in the Pacific. The Japanese soldiers were trained to die rather than surrender, and the fighting was too bitter, too personal for the niceties of prisoner taking. But intelligence was intelligence. A live Japanese soldier could tell them about troop dispositions, supply routes, defensive positions. A live Japanese soldier could save American lives. Pacheco set out after the retreating column. He followed them for 6 hours, staying well back, using every trick he knew to remain undetected. The Japanese were moving fast, eager to put distance between themselves and the nightmare they had experienced. They weren't watching their rear as carefully as they should have been. In the late afternoon, one of them fell behind. He was an older soldier, a sergeant, judging by his insignia, and he was limping from a wound in his leg. Shrapnel from one of Pacheco's grenades, probably. The wound had gone untreated, and now it was slowing him down. His comrades didn't notice. They were too focused on getting away, too scared to pay attention to anything except the trail ahead. The sergeant fell further and further behind until he was out of sight around a bend in the trail. Pacheco made his move. He came out of the jungle like a striking snake, moving faster than the wounded sergeant could react. One hand clamped over the man's mouth, cutting off any cry for help. The other pressed the muzzle of his 45 against the sergeant's temple. "Quiet," Pacheco said. His Japanese was limited to a few words he had learned from Nisei soldiers in his unit. "Quiet, no kill, come." The sergeant's eyes were wide with terror. He had seen what this American had done to his comrades. He had heard the screams in the night, had found the bodies with their throats cut. He knew that death was a heartbeat away, but he didn't resist. He let Pacheco bind his hands, let himself be led into the jungle, away from his retreating comrades. He had been captured by the ghost, and he knew better than to fight. The walk back to friendly lines took 2 days. 2 days of moving through Japanese-controlled territory, 2 days of hiding from patrols, of sleeping in snatches when he could find concealment, of keeping one eye on his prisoner and both ears tuned to the jungle around them. Pacheco moved carefully, avoiding the trails where Japanese patrols were most likely to travel. He stuck to the densest jungle where vehicles couldn't follow, where even foot patrols would struggle. His prisoner stumbled along behind him, bound at the wrist with strips of cloth torn from his own uniform, gagged to prevent any cries for help. The sergeant, Tanaka, Pacheco would learn his name later, was in bad shape. The wound on his leg was infected now, the flesh around it red and swollen, hot to the touch. He was running a fever, his eyes glassy, his movements increasingly uncoordinated. Pacheco could have left him, could have slit his throat and traveled faster without the burden. No one would have blamed him. This was the Pacific, where prisoners were rare and mercy was rarer still. But he needed this man alive. The intelligence Tanaka carried was worth more than the satisfaction of another kill. And somewhere, buried deep beneath the soldier he had become, the Paniolo remembered something his grandfather had taught him. You don't kill a beaten animal, you help it up. The first night, they sheltered in a shallow cave that Pacheco had spotted during his earlier reconnaissance, a fold in the rock that was invisible from more than 10 feet away. He gave the sergeant water from the captured canteen, fed him captured rations, treated the wound on his leg with a field dressing he had taken from one of the dead. The treatment was crude, cleaning the wound with water, packing it with sulfa powder, wrapping it with bandages that were already dirty. But it was better than nothing, and Tanaka's fever seemed to stabilize as the night wore on. The sergeant watched him with confusion, and something that might have been gratitude. He had expected to be tortured, killed, treated the way Japanese propaganda said Americans treated prisoners. Instead, this ghost, this Oni who had slaughtered his comrades, was keeping him alive, even caring for his wound. "Why?" the sergeant asked in broken English. It was the first word he had spoken since his capture. Pacheco looked at him across the darkness of the cave. "You have information. My commanders need information. That's why." "You kill my men. 12 men. They were trying to kill me. I killed them first." Pacheco shrugged, a gesture that seemed almost casual given what they had both experienced. "That's war. You, one man, only one?" "One man." The sergeant shook his head slowly, disbelief and something like awe in his eyes. "We think many Americans, whole squad, maybe platoon, commander, he say company maybe." "I know, that's what I wanted you to think." Silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of the jungle, the chirping of insects, the distant call of a night bird, the rustle of something moving through the undergrowth outside. Then the sergeant said something that Pacheco would remember for the rest of his life. "You are Oni, demon. My men, they say Oni in jungle, demon hunting us. They right." Pacheco didn't know how to respond to that. He had never thought of himself as a demon. He was just a ranch hand from Hawaii who had learned to fight because the war demanded it. But he couldn't deny what he had done. 12 men dead by his hand, 12 families who would never see their fathers, sons, brothers again. He checked the sergeant's bonds, made sure the gag was secure, and settled in for a few hours of sleep. Tomorrow would be harder. They still had miles to go. The second day was harder. Japanese patrols were everywhere, searching for the prisoner who had disappeared, hunting for the American who had terrorized their soldiers. Twice, Pacheco had to hide in the undergrowth while enemy soldiers passed within feet of his position, so close he could smell the cigarette smoke on their uniforms. Once, he had to kill a sentry who stumbled upon their hiding place. Another quick, silent death that left the sergeant staring at him with renewed terror. The killing was getting easier. That bothered Pacheco more than he wanted to admit. The first kill, back in the stream, had felt necessary but terrible. Now, 12 kills later, it felt almost routine. He wondered what that meant about him, what kind of man he was becoming. But he kept moving. The prisoner was too valuable to lose. The intelligence he carried could save American lives, could help end this war faster, could bring the boys home sooner. That was worth any amount of killing. That was worth becoming whatever he had to become. They reached the American lines on the afternoon of the second day. The forward observation post almost shot them. 2 figures emerging from the jungle. One American, filthy and staggering. One Japanese, bound and limping. It wasn't a combination that made sense. The sentries had their rifles raised, fingers on triggers, shouting challenges that Pacheco's exhausted mind could barely process. "Hold your fire!" Pacheco shouted, his voice hoarse from 2 days of silence. "Sergeant Pacheco, 25th Infantry, I have a prisoner!" There was a long moment of silence. The sentries exchanged glances, uncertain. Then one of them, a corporal, Pacheco noticed through his haze of exhaustion, stepped forward slowly, rifle still raised. Pacheco? Danny Pacheco? That's me. Jesus Christ. The corporal lowered his rifle, his eyes wide. We thought you were dead. The patrol came back 2 days ago, said you went missing during the ambush. They figured the Japs got you. They tried, Pacheco gestured at his prisoner. Didn't work out for them. More soldiers were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. They stared at the tableau. The exhausted American, the wounded Japanese, the evidence of violence that covered both men. Pacheco's uniform was torn and blood-stained. The sergeant's leg was swollen to twice its normal size. The bandages Pacheco had applied soaked through with pus and blood. The sergeant in command of the post, a different sergeant Pacheco noted with the detached clarity of extreme fatigue, pushed through the crowd. He took in the scene with one long look, then started to laugh. Jesus Christ, Pacheco, what the hell did you do out there? Pacheco thought about the 12 dead Japanese, the night attack, the 2 days of stalking through the jungle with a prisoner in tow, the kills that had become routine, the fear that had transformed into something colder and more dangerous. I went hunting, he said, and then his legs gave out, and someone caught him before he hit the ground. The intelligence extracted from Sergeant Tanaka, that was the prisoner's name they learned later, proved invaluable. The interrogation took 3 days. American intelligence officers, working with Nisei translators, questioned Tanaka for hours at a time. They were professional, methodical, using techniques that ranged from simple questioning to more sophisticated psychological approaches. Tanaka talked. He talked about everything. He told them about troop dispositions, where Japanese units were positioned, how many men they had, what condition they were in. He told them about supply routes, which trails the Japanese used to move ammunition and food, where the supply dumps were located, how frequently the convoys ran. He told them about the locations of defensive positions that the Americans had been unable to locate, bunkers and pillboxes hidden in the jungle, camouflaged so well that aerial reconnaissance had missed them completely. He told them about minefields and booby traps and the intricate systems of tunnels that the Japanese had dug into the mountainsides. He told them about Japanese morale, the growing desperation among soldiers who knew the war was lost, the shortages of food and ammunition, the disease that was spreading through units that had been in the jungle too long. He told them about the orders from Tokyo, the exhortations to fight to the last man, the promises of reinforcement that everyone knew would never come. Some of the information came freely, offered by a man who had seen enough death and wanted no more. Some came under pressure, extracted by interrogators who knew which questions to ask and how to ask them. All of it was useful. The assault that followed 3 days later used Tanaka's intelligence to bypass the strongest Japanese positions and strike at the weakest points in their line. American forces moved through gaps that Tanaka had identified, avoided the bunkers and minefields he had warned them about, hit supply dumps that the Japanese had thought were hidden. The attack succeeded beyond expectations, capturing a critical mountain pass and opening the road to the Central Valley. Japanese casualties were heavy. The defenders, surprised and outflanked, died in their positions or fled into the jungle. American casualties were lighter than predicted. The balance had shifted just a little because one man had walked out of the jungle with a prisoner. The army awarded Pacheco the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. The citation mentioned extraordinary heroism and exceptional tactical skill and complete disregard for personal safety in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. It didn't mention the 12 dead Japanese. It didn't mention the 2 nights of stalking through the jungle. It didn't mention the moment when a wounded sergeant called him Oni, demon, and he hadn't known how to respond. Citations never mentioned things like that. Pacheco served out the rest of the war in the Philippines. He was wounded twice more, once by shrapnel, once by a sniper's bullet that passed through his arm. Both times he returned to duty as soon as the doctors would let him because the war wasn't over and his unit still needed him. When Japan surrendered, he was in a hospital bed in Manila, recovering from his second wound. He heard the news on a radio that someone had set up in the ward, and he lay there listening to the cheering and crying of the men around him, feeling nothing but a strange emptiness. It was over, all of it. The fighting, the killing, the desperate days in the jungle, it was finally over. He went home to Hawaii. The journey took weeks, by transport plane to Guam, by ship to San Francisco, by another plane to Honolulu, and finally by inter-island flight to Hilo. He stood on the tarmac of the tiny airport, breathing air that smelled of flowers and rain and the sea, and felt something unclench in his chest that had been tight for 3 years. He was home. Against all odds, he was home. The Big Island hadn't changed. The same mountains rose against the sky, Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, their slopes green with forest, their peaks sometimes dusted with snow. The same ranches spread across the upland pastures, the same cattle grazing in the same fields. It was as if the war had never happened, as if the world beyond the horizon had simply ceased to exist. But Danny Pacheco had changed. He knew it the moment he stepped off the plane, knew it when his family embraced him, knew it when he looked at the familiar landscape and saw it with eyes that had witnessed things no man should see. He went back to cowboy work, riding the ranges of Parker Ranch the way his father and grandfather had before him. The work was familiar, roping and branding and moving cattle from pasture to pasture. But it felt different now. Everything felt different. He married a local girl named Leilani, who had waited for him through 4 years of war. She was the daughter of a fisherman from Kona with dark eyes and a gentle smile, and a patience that seemed infinite. She had written him letters throughout the war, letters that had followed him from training camp to combat zone to hospital, letters that had reminded him there was a world beyond the jungle and the killing. They had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, and Pacheco taught all of them to ride, to rope, to work cattle, the way Paniolo had for 100 years. He wanted them to know the land, to understand where they came from, to have roots that went deep into the red soil of the Big Island. He never talked about the war. When people asked, and people always asked, once they saw the Distinguished Service Cross in its case on the mantle, he would shrug and change the subject. The war was over. The men who had died were buried. What was there to say? But sometimes, late at night, when Leilani was asleep and the house was quiet, he would step outside and look at the stars, the same stars he had navigated by all those years ago when he was stalking through the Philippine jungle with a knife in his hand. He would think about Sergeant Tanaka, about the look in the man's eyes when he called him Oni, about the strange bond that had formed between hunter and prey during those 2 days in the jungle. He had never learned what happened to Tanaka. The sergeant had been shipped off to a POW camp somewhere, and Pacheco had never asked about him. Maybe he had survived the war, had gone home to Japan, had lived a long life with his own family. Maybe he hadn't. War didn't always provide answers. He would think about the 12 soldiers he had killed in 24 hours, silent as a ghost, deadly as a demon. He could still see their faces sometimes in his dreams, the young ones especially. The boys who had been barely old enough to shave. They had been the enemy, yes, and they would have killed him without hesitation. But they had also been human beings, with mothers and fathers and dreams of their own. He had done terrible things in that jungle, necessary things maybe, things that had saved American lives, had helped win a battle, had brought the war one step closer to its end, but terrible nonetheless. The Paniolo had taught him to grab the bull's horns when it charged. They hadn't taught him how to let go afterward. They hadn't taught him how to live with the weight of what he had done. So, he worked. He rode the ranges and roped the cattle and raised his children, and he let the rhythm of the land slowly, gradually, ease the burden that he carried. The nightmares faded over the years. The memories softened. The weight became bearable. It never went away entirely, but it became something he could live with. Daniel Pacheco died in 2001 at the age of 83. He was buried in a small cemetery overlooking the Pacific Ocean with full military honors. His Distinguished Service Cross was placed in his hands before the casket was closed. Leilani followed him 3 years later. She was buried beside him, in the red earth of the Big Island that both of them had loved. The obituary in the Hawaii Tribune Herald mentioned his service in the war, his medal, his years as a Paniolo. It didn't mention the ambush or the 12 dead Japanese or the 2 days he had spent walking through the jungle with a prisoner. But the men who served with him remembered. They told stories about Pacheco at their reunions, the man who had been ambushed by 30 Japanese soldiers and walked back to base 2 days later with a prisoner and 12 notches on his belt. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling. The numbers changed, the details shifted, but the core remained the same. One man, alone in the jungle, who had turned an ambush into a rout and brought back intelligence that changed the course of a battle. They called him the Demon, not to his face, never to his face, but among themselves. When they talked about the men who had done extraordinary things, the Oni in the jungle, the ghost who hunted hunters, the Paniolo who had grabbed the bull's horns and thrown it to the ground. Today, if you visit the 25th Infantry Division Museum at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, you can find a small exhibit dedicated to the Philippine Campaign. There is no mention of Daniel Pacheco by name. His actions were just one story among thousands in the long, bloody fight for the islands. But there is an Arisaka rifle on display, captured from a Japanese soldier during the campaign. The rifle is well preserved, its dark wood stock polished by generations of hands, its metal still showing the marks of hard use. The placard doesn't say where the rifle came from, or who captured it, or what story lies behind its journey from a Japanese armory to an American museum case. But if you look closely, you can see the initials DP scratched into the stock, the mark of a Paniolo who had taken his trophy from the jungle, the mark of a man who had turned an ambush into a rout and walked out of the wilderness with a prisoner and a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. The museum doesn't tell you about the 12 kills. It doesn't tell you about the night attack, or the long walk through enemy territory, or the wounded sergeant who called his captor a demon. Museums rarely tell the whole story. They show the artifacts and the citations and the photographs, and they leave the rest to imagination. But the men who served with Pacheco remembered. They told stories about him at their reunions, stories that grew more elaborate with each telling, but whose core remained unchanged. The Paniolo from the Big Island, the Oni in the jungle, the man who had been ambushed by 30 Japanese soldiers and walked out 2 days later with a prisoner and 12 notches on his belt. Some men are born for war. Some men become warriors because circumstances demand it. And some men, a very few, discover something inside themselves that others never see, a capacity for violence and survival that exists only in the darkest corners of the human soul. Daniel Pacheco was one of those men. He had found the demon inside himself, had let it loose in the Philippine jungle, and had somehow managed to cage it again when the war was over. That was the hardest part, perhaps, not the killing. The killing had been almost easy once he started, but the coming back, the returning to normal life, to cattle and family, and the peaceful rhythms of the ranch, the learning to be human again after being something else for 2 days in the jungle. He had managed it. Not everyone did, but Danny Pacheco had grabbed the bull's horns, and he had never let go, not until the bull was thrown, not until the battle was won, not until he could go home and be the man he had been before the war, the demon of the Philippine mountains, the Oni who hunted hunters. 30 soldiers went into the jungle looking for one man. 2 days later, that one man walked out with a prisoner and 12 kills. When the bull charges, you grab its horns. Danny Pacheco had grabbed them, and in the end, he had let go. That was the real victory. Not the 12 dead enemies, not the captured sergeant, not the intelligence that changed the course of a battle. The real victory was walking out of that jungle and finding his way home, not just to Hawaii, but to himself. Some men never make that journey. Some men leave pieces of themselves in places like that Philippine jungle, and they never get them back. But Danny Pacheco found his way home, and he lived the rest of his life as proof that even a demon could become a man again. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. These stories of individual courage deserve to be remembered and shared. Drop a comment below. Could you have done what Pacheco did, alone against 30, turning the hunters into the hunted? And if you haven't already, check out our previous video on the Philippine Campaign, the larger context for this incredible story of one man's survival and triumph. Until next time.